Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 2, we'll be talking with Santiago Lyon about trusting what we see. Santiago Lyon is the head of advocacy and education for the Adobe-led Content Authenticity Initiative, working to combat misinformation through digital content provenance. He has 40 years of experience in photography as an award-winning photojournalist, photo editor, media executive, and educator. As a photographer for Reuters and the Associated Press for 20 years, he won multiple photojournalism awards for his work between 1989 and 1999, where he photographed 9 wars on 4 continents. In 2023-2024, he was a Nieman Fellow in Journalism at Harvard University, before being named as VP and Director of Photography at the Associated Press, a position he held until 2016. Under his direction, the AP won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for photography, as well as multiple other major photojournalism awards around the world. In 2012, he was a Sulzberger Fellow at Columbia University and was chair of the jury for the 2013 World Press Photo Contest. Santiago serves on the board of directors for the Eddie Adams Workshop and the advisory board of the Seven Foundation. So can we start with you just telling us about the kind of work that you do?
At the moment, I work on something called the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is an Adobe-led cross-industry initiative to try and establish and implement a global standard around the provenance or the origins of digital file types, so that people can have an understanding of where images, video, audio, etc. come from, how those files might have been manipulated, and then sharing some or all of that information with the viewer. So it's an effort to combat mis and disinformation, among other things.
That is obviously something that's really vital and just of real importance in today's visual landscape. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to that. Because your background is in photojournalism yourself, is that correct?
Yeah, so the work that I'm doing now in many ways is a logical extension of my life's work in photojournalism. I was a photographer in the field for about 20 years, working for Reuters and then the Associated Press. I was covering, to start, general news, sports, entertainment, those kinds of stories. And then I spent about a decade mainly covering war and conflict around the world. I photographed 9 wars on 4 continents and dedicated a long part of my life and career to that kind of work, which not surprisingly left me a little bit exhausted. And so I was lucky enough to get a mid-career fellowship at Harvard University, something called a Nieman Fellowship, that allowed me to take stock of the previous 20 years working in the field. And then that morphed into a job as director of photography and then vice president in charge of photography at the Associated Press. So I was overseeing the entirety of the Associated Press's global photo operations, overseeing roughly 1,000 photographers around the world between staff and freelance who were putting out about 1 million pictures a year. But then in addition, I was also involved in training and in safety. And for a time, I oversaw all of the AP's operations from Asia, including text, video, and photos. I was involved in the opening of a bureau, an Associated Press bureau in Pyongyang in North Korea, among other things. So I've been very fortunate and very blessed to have had a long and rich and fruitful career in the world of journalism. And now the work that I'm doing around provenance, for me, feels very natural. It's an extension of that life's work in journalism.
Absolutely. Like, I feel like you bring so much experience from so many different sides of the industry and very many different perspectives within the industry. And I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit about, how you found that transition from being a photographer to working in more of the decision-making side of things, for example, when you're at the Associated Press, and what kinds of ethical considerations, or how did that shape maybe how you thought about ethics in your work as a photojournalist?
Yeah, I mean, my work as a photographer was always for the major news agencies, first Reuters and then AP. And those news agencies have a well-defined code of ethics in terms of what's acceptable, whether it's, not setting up pictures in the field and not manipulating images beyond certain thresholds in Photoshop and other programs. Basic journalistic ethics that I think are common to most respectable news outlets. And so I had that grounding in the field. And so when I moved into a leadership role, into executive functions, that was normal. I had started my career in journalism. And in fact, I sort of grew up in journalism. My father was a journalist. Some of my earliest memories are from the world of journalism. So for me, the whole career aspect of journalism was more of a vocation and more of a calling than a sort of 9-to-5 job. And with that vocation comes the responsibility to adhere to those codes of ethics and to be truthful and transparent and not to mislead people and to be sure that all the work that you're doing, is a faithful recording of what's going on around you. So the transition, I had been, as I said, in the field for many years. And then towards the end of my time in the field, I was overseeing a small photo operation in Spain and Portugal for the AP. I was the chief photographer for Spain and Portugal. So I was overseeing a handful of freelance photographers. And the leadership aspects of that role in some ways prepared me for the leadership aspects of the director of photography role, albeit on a different scale. And in some ways, it was just the same in the sense of, the ethical aspects of it were important, making sure that the photographers that I was working with, whether it was at a small scale in Spain and Portugal or whether at a larger scale globally, understood what the quote-unquote rules were. And to that end, the AP has a very, useful code of ethics that people are expected to adhere to. And in some ways, it was just about making sure that people adhered to those things and taking measures when they didn't. There were a few occasions when people made mistakes or, transgressed that code of ethics. And so we took the appropriate responses then. But it all felt very natural for me because I had grown up in that world, and it was a continuum from photographer in the field, if you like, soldier, to general. In other words, I went from being a soldier to an officer in some ways, and that same understanding from my time in the field served me very well in an executive function.
And I guess the idea of like transparency and accuracy that you are dealing so much with your work now would have been so critical in all of those other positions that you've held. And I guess I wonder, can you think back to any examples of a time when there was maybe a challenge with transparency or a challenge in communicating something accurately through images with an audience?
Well, we had some situations when I was running the AP's photo operation. We had some situations in Pakistan, for example, where some of AP's photographers were making pictures of scenes that had been orchestrated or set up by other photographers. And we came to see this because the AP's images were on occasion very similar to other images that were clearly set up, as it were. And so what we did then was to hold some training sessions for all of AP's staff and freelance around the country. And we traveled around the country just educating them as to what the AP standards around that kind of thing were. And they were very grateful for the guidance because they had not received that kind of guidance before. And in some cases, they were surprised. They were like, oh, you mean I can't set up a picture or I can't ask somebody to do something? And we were like, no, you have to, adhere to the scene as you saw it, and not overly or not influence the scene. I mean, your very presence might influence the scene because you're there with a camera, but certainly nothing like asking people to do things that they might never have done or they might have done before you got there or whatever the case may be. So that was an example, I think, of training photographers in ethical conduct. And, the AP, where I spent a total of 25 years, is a very, I would say, rigorous organization when it comes to ethics and standards and transparency, in part because as a news agency, the AP's main business is licensing photos, video, text, and other kinds of content to myriad consumer-facing news organizations around the world. The AP has something like 10,000 customers around the world.
You mentioned licensing, and it did bring to mind a bit of a controversy about, I know that there was some controversy with Adobe's selling AI-generated images of the genocide in Gaza on the stock platform. And so I was wondering, how does AI fit into the licensing question? Because I think that that's quite interesting and potentially quite dicey.
Well, to start with, the stock photography world is very different from the world of photojournalism. The stock photography world, where I spent a couple of years doing business development at Adobe, is really about licensing images for commercial purposes. And so all of the images in the stock photography world have been scrubbed, for example, of intellectual property. So, of course, they do that using Photoshop and other tools. That's the polar opposite of the photojournalism world, where, pretty much nothing is manipulated other than to more accurately represent the scene as the photographer saw it, as opposed to how the camera sensor might have captured it, understanding that the camera sensor is a lot less sophisticated than the human eye. So with that context, then, Adobe stock decided to accept AI-generated images for licensing purposes. And all of those images were clearly labeled as AI. And in some cases, creative people, photographers, whoever they might be, were using AI to reproduce scenes of warfare, and then were labeling them as, having been made in Gaza or in other parts of the world, when in fact they were completely artificial creations. So there was a fair amount of controversy, as you point out, because people felt that it was unacceptable to be licensing AI-generated photographs of real war. And I think the issue here is really around context and usage. In other words, the fact that these images were clearly labeled as AI on the one hand, but were also labeled as, being from places where they couldn't have been because they're artificial images. That was part of the issue. And then the other issue, I think, was around intent. As I mentioned, the stock photography world is generally not for photojournalistic purposes. It's understood to be another part of the photography world. So in response to the controversy, Adobe took down a whole bunch of images that purported to be from Gaza and that had been created using AI, and made a good faith effort to address the situation. And so that's really all there was to it.
I think that's a really helpful differentiation that you've offered between photojournalism and stock imagery, because I do sometimes think that we can conflate those, or maybe that they are conflated sometimes in how they're actually used as well. Because I guess a stock imagery database is very different from a photojournalistic database of images for publications to draw on. Like those look similar, they function similarly, but I guess they serve very different purposes and are intended for very different outputs. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. The stock photography area is a super high volume area of photography. The major stock licensing houses, Adobe, Shutterstock, Getty, and others, they're processing somewhere in the region of 1 million images a week, whereas the AP's total yearly output is 1 million or so images. So it's a magnitude, 50 or so times bigger in terms of volume. And what that does is it lowers the prices. So you can license stock imagery for very little relative to what you might license a photojournalistic image for. And for some news outlets that are struggling to make ends meet, it's an attractive proposition to use a stock photograph to illustrate a news story, when a stock photograph has all sorts of ethical issues from the photojournalistic standpoint, the way it was edited, what might have been taken out of it for stock purposes, etc. And the fact that the captions in stock photography are very different from the captions in news photography, so the context becomes very important. Context in news photography is everything. You have to understand when the picture was made, what it shows, and a whole host of other journalistic details in order to make sure that it's relevant to the story that you're attempting to illustrate with the photography. In the stock photography world, because our initial purpose is different, it's primarily for commercial purposes, for advertising purposes, it doesn't really fit. But yet, on occasion, you see news outlets licensing stock photography because it's cheaper, because they don't have anything else to use. And they might put stock photograph, but it's often hard to know if the reader will understand the difference between that with a few tiny letters under a picture. If you work in the industry, you're trained to look at captions and understand the source of imagery. But if you're a general news consumer, you might not have that training, and depending on where you're looking at the imagery, whether it's a smartphone screen or a laptop screen, you might not even notice that. It's apples and oranges, and occasionally they get conflated, and occasionally there is controversy, and it's, I think, very important to clarify the difference between those two areas.
Absolutely, and I think that difference that you're pointing out kind of parallels the tension that we've talked about in other podcast episodes about, what is news and what is the lack of awareness, maybe publicly or among the general public, about the role of the media and what is journalism. And I think that maybe that's, another layer to that sort of maybe misunderstanding, not only about where our news comes from, but how it's made as well, and what the value of it is. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, because there's a whole process that goes into creating photojournalism or news content of any kind. It's gathered in the field, it's edited, and then it's sent into editing desks for validation or verification. So in the case of news agency photography, whether it's AP, Reuters, AFP, and Getty, which, underwrite the vast or significant percentage of news imagery that people see around the world, nothing goes out from those news agencies without having been properly vetted. So the picture comes in from the field, an editor looks at it, they make sure that the caption is correct, they make sure that the spellings are correct, they make sure that all the necessary contextual information is included in the caption, they make sure that the image is, useful in the sense that it's not overly graphic. They look for obscenity, they look for nudity, they look for things like that. And when they're satisfied that the image meets the standards of their particular news organization, then they send it out to the thousands or tens of thousands of customers around the world. And those customers know, based on the source, whether it's AP or Reuters or AFP, that it's a trustworthy, reliable image. So the basic commodity that they're dealing with in that world and in journalism writ large is the notion of trust. And it's hugely important. But for many people who see those images on websites, wherever they may be, they're unaware of that rigor that goes into that process. They may be familiar with the bigger journalistic brands, but they also may not be. So I think what's starting to happen now is that, we live in a world where, to start with, there is pretty much zero secure empirical evidence about the origins of any content that we consume online, other than the brand that may have published it or distributed it. And as a result, we're guided by those brands, or we're guided by hearsay, rumor, gossip, habit, whatever it might be. And sometimes those guiding things serve us well, but sometimes they don't. And then over the last 18 months or so, you've seen the introduction of generative AI, which has really cast a shadow of doubt over everything. It's what some people refer to as the liar's dividend. In other words, if one thing can be fake, then presumably everything can be fake. And with the ease with which images can be created now with a few keystrokes, you can create hyper-realistic images of whatever you like. That shadow of doubt, I think, makes it ever more important that people have access to the information about the origins of the content that they're looking at, the provenance, as it were, which is why the work of the Content Authenticity Initiative, where I am now at Adobe, I think is more relevant than ever. We like to think about it like a digital nutrition label. In the same way you go to a supermarket and you buy a foodstuff, you can quickly see what's in that food product, how much sugar, salt, calories, whatever it might be. And then you can make an informed decision of whether or not that's something that you want to consume. Similarly, I think for news content, it's important that people have access to this provenance information so that they can make better informed decisions about what to trust and what not to trust. And we see it every day. I mean, we saw it here in the United States just yesterday or the day before, where, a presidential candidate was calling into doubt a picture showing supporters of another presidential candidate gathered at an airport, accusing the candidate of having used AI to conflate or to, misrepresent the size of the crowd, when in fact all of the analysis that was done would indicate that the photograph is real. But it takes news organizations a lot of time and effort to make that analysis, whereas if that were readily available, which is what we aspire to on the work that I'm doing now, the consumers could see that information themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it does make you think about the amount of time and energy that has to be invested in not only doing the work, but then proving that you've done the work, for photographers, I'm thinking. It makes me want to know, for photographers listening to this podcast, what should they know about the Content Authenticity Initiative? What should they be doing, or how can they engage with it, or how should they be making use of it in their workflow?
Well, I would say the first thing is to familiarize themselves with the Content Authenticity Initiative. And then if they're interested, to join the initiative. Joining the initiative is completely free. We welcome individuals, we welcome organizations, we welcome companies. Really, it's a large and fast-growing community currently of 3,200 members and growing every day. And access to that community is easy, but the access also gives you more information. We're starting to do more community events with our membership to keep them abreast of all of the various advances in technology as it relates to different sectors of the digital world, different geographies, different fields of expertise, etc. And then the other thing is to know that, the Content Authenticity Initiative, we divide our work up into a number of key areas, starting with capture. So we're working with all the major camera manufacturers to incorporate this technology into their devices at production, meaning that probably early next year, you'll be able to buy cameras from the major manufacturers with this technology already installed on it. And then you, as the user, can choose to turn that technology on or off, depending on what the default settings are. But if you turn it on, what it does is it establishes what device was used to generate a particular image, for example, and secures a bunch of other useful metadata fields. So it establishes the provenance at origin. The next area that we look at is editing. So we've incorporated this technology into Photoshop and Lightroom, and it'll be coming to Premiere for video. We've also done a lot of work with Photo Mechanic, which which is a very ubiquitous, editing software or workflow software in the photojournalism world. So there you're able to keep track of the changes that were made to a digital file. If I crop an image, tone it, darken it, lighten it, whatever I do to it, I can then go back and see what changes were made. So it establishes that edit history. And then the third area that we're working in is in the area of publishing. So we're working with all of the major publishers, social media, news media, and others, and particularly their content management system providers, to facilitate the display of that provenance information in an interactive way through what we call content credentials. Content credentials is this notion of a digital nutrition label that allows you to see where did the image or where did the file come from, and have a better sense of how it might have been altered along its journey. So those three areas of capture, edit, and publish, we've made great progress over the last 3 or 4 years. And what we're starting to see now is that major players are getting involved. So, Google, Meta, TikTok, OpenAI have all announced implementation to one degree or another of this technical standard that the Content Authenticity Initiative seeks to implement. The technical standard itself comes from an organization that Adobe helped to found together with Microsoft and Intel and the BBC and others, called the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And that's a nonprofit organization housed within the Linux Foundation, which means that all of the development work around the open standard upon which all of this is based is unencumbered by IP. It's available for anybody and everybody to use. And as such, with the addition of maybe 150 or so major technology companies working on that technical standard, that standard has fast emerged as the gold standard for provenance technology. So what the Content Authenticity Initiative is doing then is seeking to accelerate and facilitate implementation of that underlying C2PA standard through the community work that we do and through the construction of open source tools that facilitate implementation of the C2PA standard. So that's really what we're doing in a nutshell. And I think it behooves, photographers and other people in the imaging industry to get involved and to learn and to see what's going on. In addition, I would say also to understanding the AI tools. There's a host of generative AI providers out there, and I think it's really important that people understand the power of those technologies and go and experiment with them and see how they work. The good news is that Firefly and OpenAI have now started to attach content credentials to all of the output from those text image generators. So there's, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of images out there with content credentials. And now the next step is to create the interactive interface so that publishing platforms can make it obvious to viewers that those files contain content credentials.
Absolutely. So the idea of authenticity and image provenance is one massive issue within the emerging field of generative AI. But I know that another issue is the way that these generators learn from images out there. And I know that there's been a big push to think about, well, how do we give people the option to opt in or opt out of having their images used in a image learning database, I guess it is. But also, how do we fairly compensate photographers because their work is then influencing the work that is to come? And I believe Adobe has a method of this. Is that correct?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Firefly, which is Adobe's suite of text-image products, is only trained on imagery for which we have the permission from the copyright owners or imagery that's in the common domain. And that differentiates Adobe's offering in that space from a lot of the other players who have effectively scraped, the entire internet in order to train their AI models. So that's a first differentiator. Within the content credentials themselves, this provenance technology that I mentioned before, there is the opportunity for creators to add what we call a do not train label, which is a flag to the AI companies that they shouldn't use that information. And we're working with those companies to get them to see if we can get them to respect those labels, which affords the creative or the photographer a little bit of protection. The other issue that we see in this space is that when owners of intellectual property seek legal redress in the courts, and they go to the courts and say, look, my image was used to train this model, yet I am receiving no compensation for it. I didn't even know about it. I certainly didn't give my permission, etc. The court's view is, yes, your image may have been used to train the model, but can you prove that your image is present in the output? And while the technology to do that exists, at the moment it's nascent and it's expensive and it's slow. So at the moment, then, the plaintiffs, in this case the owners of intellectual property, don't seem to have any legal recourse in the courts thus far. I think as the technology develops and as it becomes possible over time to demonstrate that images were, predominantly produced using whatever the source imagery was, that will change the dynamic. But for the moment, that's not the case. So the do not train label that's available in content credentials is a useful flag, not only for the generative AI companies in the sense of indicating that they shouldn't use that material, but also possibly for the plaintiffs in legal cases to say, my flag was ignored. But this is such a fast-moving and relatively new area. Generative AI in this form has only really been around for 18 months or so, and so the courts are still trying to figure out how to handle it, and the creatives are still trying to figure out how to handle it. But there's a very interesting website called haveibeentrained.com that allows you to upload your images, and it will tell you if they are present in data training sets. And so I uploaded some images the other day from my time at the Associated Press, just out of curiosity. And sure enough, images that I shot, 30 years ago in Afghanistan had been used for AI training purposes, certainly without my knowledge and probably without the knowledge of the owners of that imagery, which in this case is the Associated Press. So it's a little bit of a wild west out there in terms of what's going on.
Absolutely. And you mentioned as well, that it would be a good exercise for photographers or image makers to have a look at these AI image generators to see how powerful they are. And it made me think, I think a lot of the discourse around AI image generation is based in concern and worry. And I think there are a lot of really good reasons for that. I think there's quite a lot of well-founded concern and worry. But I also wonder, what are the positive potentials for AI image generation as you see it?
Well, I think creativity is huge. One of Adobe's mottos is creativity for all. And a lot of Adobe programs are aimed at creatives to facilitate that creative process. And I think the generative AI stuff that's out there now is amazing when it comes to creativity. You can ideate something, and with a few keystrokes, you can create an image from it or a video from it, which is coming soon, or an illustration or things of that nature. Now, whether you use the output as it is, or whether you use it as a sort of a co-pilot, or whether you use it as a catalyst for further creativity, that's up to each individual. But I think the potential is amazing. Now, when it comes to the intersection of the world of journalism and generative AI, that's where it can get quite interesting. I was talking to some people the other day who were interested in doing a project using AI to illustrate situations that are impossible to photograph because of access issues, for example. And I was having a conversation with somebody involved in that project and making the point that if you're going to use AI, in my opinion, to do journalistic storytelling, it should be very, very clear that it's AI. For example, I don't believe that you should use hyper-realistic AI-generated imagery to illustrate, contemporary news stories, even if you put health warnings and labels all over it saying, this was made with AI, don't confuse it with the real thing, it was for illustrative purposes only. And the reason I think that's potentially hazardous is because contextual information can get stripped off of imagery with great ease. And then the image can be interpreted on its face value, and the face value is not necessarily accurate because of the need for that contextual information. So my suggestion to these particular people was, why don't you use AI, which you can do right now, to generate sort of things that are clearly illustrations or clearly drawings or clearly not realistic? And I think there's a lot of, interesting potential there. For example, in the United States, unfortunately, we see any number of school shootings. And of course, access is impossible for journalists, even after the fact, because those places are often considered crime scenes and, evidence is gathered and then everything is taken away. So the notion of using AI to illustrate the circumstances of school shootings, but doing it in a way that is clearly illustrative, and that the style would be a drawing or a line drawing or, some sort of imagery that in no way could be confused with the hyperrealistic imagery that we get from photography. I think that could be quite useful. Or, perhaps hard to illustrate stories around technology or finance or things like that, where actually photographing very complicated things or opaque things is very challenging, using AI to help foment understanding of those events. But again, in a way that makes it very clear that it is AI, and not just through labeling, but through the output, that the output be in the form of a drawing or a graph or something that is in no way, shape, or form to be confused with a real image.
I feel like that it's exactly that, isn't it? For me, anyway, it's the photorealistic uses of AI that I think have often the most complicated responses or the most complicated questions that come with them. So I think that that's a really interesting proposition about, using it to do things that are more illustrative. If I were to put on my hat, pretend I was a illustrator, I feel like I wouldn't overly love that myself, though, because it would be putting me potentially out of work if it's doing the type of illustration that I could otherwise do. And I guess that's maybe the gap that the photorealistic AI plays, is that it can create images that look like photographs. I think that there's value in everything, and it's all about how we use it. But I do think that AI has those added considerations or questions that come with it about, the impact on the creative industries, also the environmental impacts of it. I'm doing a research project right now with the university using AI generated images, and these are things that I'm struggling with and to unpick as well. And I don't think any of us have the solution at this point. That was not really a question. That was a series of thoughts, but maybe you want to comment on it.
Technology has always influenced creativity. When photography came around, a lot of painters at the time, I think, were upset. But then, we saw the rise of Impressionism or Cubism or, other forms of art that were more interpretive in nature. When the car came around, people said, well, we need faster horses. And then, people got used to the car. So I think technology has always had an effect on people's lives and will continue to have an effect on people's lives. I guess it's a question of whether you can embrace the power of technology and still be true to your values wherever they may lie, whether it's in the journalism world or the creative world or anything else for that matter. And harnessing the power. I mean, while I think AI needs to be handled with care, I also think AI can bring huge value to all sorts of endeavors, whether it's academia or creativity or whatever it might be, because it allows for very rapid synthesis of information and creation of new material based on that information in a wide variety of formats, not just imagery, but, research, mathematics, science, computer coding, etc. So I think AI has a huge amount of potential, but it needs to be handled with care. And I think that's the stage where we're at now, is governments around the world are trying to figure it out. You're seeing legislation, whether it's in the EU or the UK, or other parts of the world, that is mandating some level of transparency around the use of AI so that people understand very clearly what it is they're looking at. And I think that's important. So that's really how I see the world of AI, broadly speaking, as one of great potential, but one that needs to be navigated carefully, especially at the beginning, which is where we are now. And the other thing I would say is that it really behooves us to use our imaginations. If we imagine a world in, say, 5 years when the use of AI has likely become normalized, in a variety of areas, and we imagine what that world is going to look like in terms of the quality and the quantity and the speed with which information can be processed. That's sort of exhilarating and a little scary at the same time. But I think the potential is there, and it's on us as a species to embrace it and to shepherd it. After all, we invented it, right? So those are my thoughts on that. In terms of the energy, I was looking at some statistics the other day around, energy use around AI. And while it certainly does use a lot of energy, I think we're seeing two things. One, it's not quite as dramatic as people might think to start as a percentage of the overall use of energy relative to heating or cooling or other things like that. But also that these chips that are used to process all of this information are getting more and more efficient. And the companies that make those chips are really conscious of the need that they be more efficient. And in the same way that other areas of energy are more efficient, photovoltaic cells, for example, to generate solar energy have become more and more efficient over the last 20 or 30 years, cheaper to produce, generate more energy, etc. So I think we're going to see more advances in technology that will help make this kind of technology safer in many areas.
If you had to give one piece of advice to people who are wanting to use AI image generation and do so ethically, what piece of advice would you give them?
I would experiment with the technology, and then I would compare that process to existent ethical codes, whether those are individual or organizational or whatever ethical codes we're talking about here, and make sure that you're comfortable doing whatever it is you're doing. I mean, we all have our standards, and we should all aspire, in my mind, to live to our standards. So when something new or relatively new like generative AI comes into the environment, I think it's really important that we be comfortable using the technology and also understanding to what degree we want to use it. Do we want to use it as a co-pilot? Do we want to use it as a source of inspiration? Do we want to use it as a way of being perhaps more creative than we are now? And how are we going to adapt? And then how is the marketplace going to adapt? Because in the world of photojournalism, at the end of the day, most people aspire to make a living from it. And so where are the opportunities for people to make a living in the photojournalism world when we see the price of imagery has gone down dramatically over the last, 30, 40 years? When we see that it's very difficult for freelancers in particular to make a living in the world of photojournalism, when we see that AI is being used in some cases to create imagery and disrupting things, which is why I think it's super important, as I said before, for people to really embrace this technology and become familiar with it. And then once they're familiar with it, they can make better informed decisions about how they want to use it, or if they want to use it, or if they just want to be aware of it and keep track of it. But I think it's really important to know and to understand these new technologies and how they affect the environments that we live in and how we might be able to harness them for the greater good.
Is there anything that I should have asked but didn't?
I think that if there's one thing that I find a little bit challenging, so I've been working on this content authenticity initiative now for, 3.5 years or so. It's taking a long time for people to become aware of the need for provenance information. I think that there are a whole host of sort of interdependent industries, not leastly the news industry, that would benefit from embracing this technology more rapidly than they currently are. I mean, we're making good progress with a lot of the major players in this industry, but not surprisingly, the news industry has its own series of, some would say, existential challenges around sustainability and viability, et cetera. So I understand that there are challenges in that industry. However, since the basic commodity of journalism is trust, and since we live in a world where trust is elusive, and increasingly so because of some of these AI technologies, I think it would behoove all of the major players in the news industry space to accelerate their adoption of provenance technologies because it underpins and buttresses existing trust models that will serve them well as we continue to go down to the path of increasing technological advances and challenges and difficulties, etc. I think that's the biggest single point that I would like to emphasize to anybody who's listening out there.
And the last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
I mean, to me, photography ethics is really about veracity and transparency and accuracy and context. And when somebody looks at a picture, that they have all of that information at their disposal and can trust the image that they're looking at because they understand the context. And I think there are challenges sometimes with that because we're all filters. Photographers are all filters in the sense of we all perceive the world slightly differently and we all show slightly different aspects of the world. That can be informed by our upbringings or our biases or any number of things. But I think for me, it really means about photographing things as they are and describing them as they are and having that level of transparency while at the same time allowing for layers of creativity that can interpret the scene in a way that renders it compelling to the viewer without compromising the authenticity of the scene. And I believe that photojournalists fall into a sort of a spectrum where at one end you have very cerebral, literal photojournalists who basically lift their camera and photograph what's in front of them and leave it at that. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have highly creative photojournalists who, are able to make incredibly beautiful and compelling images of anything. And like any spectrum, there's a continuum. And so understanding where one is on that spectrum, I think is important because it helps to situate oneself and helps to contextualize oneself in the broader world of photojournalism and decide where one would like to be or what one might aspire to. I think those are all useful things to consider because, there's room for everybody. There's room for everything. And it's really about being truthful, but also being faithful to where one sees oneself on that continuum in line with values and principles and things of that nature.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Lauren Walsh on conflict photography.